بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. When we think about the obligations of Islam, what will normally come to our minds is things like Salah, praying 5 times a day, Saum, fasting in Ramadan, and so on. And these are obligations, and these are important obligations of Islam. But one of the very important obligations, which is learning religious knowledge, often wouldn't come to the mind of an ordinary Muslim when they are asked, what are the obligations of Islam? Even though learning religious knowledge is a very important obligation, and in fact, the key to other obligations being fulfilled in the proper manner. A person cannot pray their salah properly unless they have the proper requisite knowledge of how to pray their salah properly. And similarly with all other obligations. And even Muslims that are conscious of the fact that this is an obligation on me, this is a fard, this is a religious obligation on me to learn religious knowledge, often many Muslims will just assume that I have that knowledge by a process of osmosis, or I've passively acquired that knowledge, or just from what I learned as a child at home, that's sufficient. They just assume that they have that requisite knowledge, that obligatory knowledge that every Muslim must have. But as many teachers of Islamic knowledge will testify, ignorance is pervasive. And when we say ignorance, we're talking about even what is obligatory on every individual, or in a particular circumstance, what is obligatory on a person to know about the deen, about religion, they are ignorant of it. And they are not excused for that ignorance. So when a person is baligh, as in they are mature, and they are aqil, they are sane, they're not insane, they have an obligation to have certain knowledge. And yes, that is circumstance dependent. So we'll look at that, inshallah, in this presentation. It is context dependent to some degree. And that's why the person must know that in my situation, what is obligatory on me that I have the knowledge of. So that's what we're going to explore a little bit today from the statements of some of the major scholars throughout the Islamic history. So there's a famous hadith, طَلَبُ الْعِلْمِ فَرِيضَةٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ, which is very well known. Acquiring knowledge is an obligation on every Muslim. And there's disagreement regarding this hadith, whether it is authentically attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. There are many scholars who say that it's actually not authentically attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. It was definitely a statement that was popular amongst within the time of the Salaf, but whether it's attributable to the Prophet ﷺ is a point of disagreement. But regardless of that disagreement, everybody agrees, all of the ulama, all of the scholars agree that its meaning is correct, that there is some knowledge that is obligatory on every Muslim to acquire. Right? And that's obvious as well, because as Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah, he says in his one of the chapter titles, Bab al-ilmu qabla al-qawli wal-amal, there are certain things that we must believe. The Quran says to have iman and to believe certain things. There are certain things that we must do. There are certain things that we must refrain from. But how are those things possible to do unless you have the knowledge? So it's also obvious that knowledge is required, is obligatory on every Muslim. So what is that knowledge that is required? So Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, rahimahullah, one of the very prominent imams from the time of the Salaf, he was asked, as reported by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi in Al-Faqih wal-Mutafaqih, with a reliable chain, that Abdullah ibn Mubarak, rahimahullah, he was asked, what does this mean? Talabul ilmi fadilatun ala kulli Muslim. And he said, because when they use the term talabul ilm, normally it meant people who are students of hadith and high-level knowledge, who've already covered the basic obligation, the basic obligatory knowledge. Now they're going on to higher level knowledge. So Abdullah ibn Mubarak, rahimahullah, said, no, it's not this higher level knowledge, but rather seeking knowledge is obligatory in the sense that a man happens upon something related to his deen and he asks about it until he knows it, right? So a person happens to find himself in a particular situation where he needs to know what is the religious obligation on me in this situation, and he must inquire about it and learn that knowledge, right? So this is what came to be known as ilmul hal, ilmul hal, which is the knowledge of the context or the particular circumstance that a person finds themselves in, right? So for instance, when a person becomes baligh and they are mature, then they will have to start observing the rules of hijab, for example. And this would apply obviously to women, but also boys and men, once they become baligh, they will need to know, who can I be alone with, for example, who are my mahrams who I can be alone with, and who can I, or who do I have to make sure that I don't see their hair, for example. And a lot of people don't know this. They don't know, for instance, that their brother's wife, for example, is not a mahram, right? Or their aunt by marriage is not a mahram. Whereas this is obligatory knowledge for a person who finds themselves in that situation, that they must know that. Or, for instance, when a family member dies in a family, then it's necessary for them to know what is the obligation regarding the person's estate and what they've left behind, how must it be distributed, and what must be done with it, right? And when a person gets married, for example, they must know the rules regarding different aspects of that as well, right? For example, rules regarding intimacy. And this is also very pervasive, the ignorance regarding when does ghusl, for example, become obligatory on a person. There are a lot of people who have been married for years, sometimes decades, and they don't know a particular situation, for example, where ghusl was necessary for me in order for my purification to be done and my salah to be done, and they didn't know that that was necessary, and therefore they didn't do it, right? So this is ilmul hal, which is the knowledge of the particular circumstance where a person finds themselves in. They must have that knowledge. That knowledge is obligatory. It's not optional. Imam al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah, in his Al-Risala, he talks about something called ilmu amma, or al-ilmu al-am, basically general knowledge. So in the statement of Abdullah al-Mubarak, we've seen ilmu al-hal, like circumstantial or a contextual knowledge. And Imam al-Shafi'i, he talks about al-ilmu al-am, لا يسع بالغا غير مغلوب على عقله جهله. right? Which every person who is sane and who is baligh must know, right? So this is the basic fundamental knowledge that is like a baseline that every Muslim has to know. And it's not really context dependent. As in, to be a Muslim, everybody must know, for example, that Allah exists. Allah is the creator. Allah is one. He has no partner. He has no nothing resembling him, and so on. Right. So this is also a fard, obligatory knowledge. Right. So we've seen that there's two aspects. One is the general knowledge that every Muslim must know, and then there's the knowledge which is context dependent, which every Muslim must be cognizant of and conscious of, that I find myself in this situation, therefore I must know, I must learn the knowledge related to this situation. Ishaq ibn Rahawayh, rahimahullah, a well-known Imam from the time of the Salaf, he said that regarding talabul ilmi faridatun ala kulli Muslim, he regards this hadith to be inauthentic. But he says the meaning is authentic, right? The meaning is authentic. And يلزمه علم ما يحتاج إليه من وضوئه وصلاته وزكاته إن كان له مال وكذلك الحج وغيره وغيره. Right? So it's necessary for him to have the knowledge of what he needs to have knowledge of, like wudu and salah and zakah if he's got wealth, and likewise hajj if he's got wealth, and other knowledge. So he's referring again to both, really, ilm am and ilm al-hal. Ibn Abdul Barr, rahimahullah, in his very well-known work on the topic of ilm, very detailed book, Jami' Bayan al-Ilmi wa Fadlih, he has a section on what is the fard knowledge, what is the fard al-ain knowledge, and then what is the fard al-kifaya knowledge. And he mentions the knowledge that ma la yasa'ul insana jahluhu, right? The knowledge that a person cannot not know, as in they have to know. And so this is the ilm amma that Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah mentioned. And Ibn Abdul Barr gives several examples, things like Allah is one, Allah has no partners, has no likeness, Allah is the creator of everything, and that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is Allah's messenger, the belief in Jannah and Jahannam, the Quran being Allah's word and it being true from Allah. And he mentions, of course, the 5 salahs. And he also mentions about the 5 salahs, وَيَلْزَمُهُ مِنْ عِلْمِهَا عِلْمُ مَا لَا تَتِمُّ إِلَّا بِهِ. Again, that's something obvious, right? In order for his knowledge of the 5 salahs to be complete, he must also know what is required to complete, or what is required to perform the salah correctly, right? Again, there's a lot of ignorance regarding salah. And obviously, that's not just the salah, but also the prerequisites of salah, like tahara and purification. But even in the salah as well, the recitation has to be correct to the best of one's ability. And they must know what are the things that will mean that I have to do sajdatul sahu, or my salah will become invalidated if I do this, and what must I do if this situation arises in the salah, and so on. Right? That's not to say that every single situation that could potentially arise in the salah, every person has to know that. But they must know the basics. And then if they do find themselves in a particular situation where they are not sure, then they must go and find out. Right? So that's also part of learning. When they find themselves in a particular situation, they must go to a learned person and find out. They can't just guess, and they can't just remain ignorant. So Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi rahimahullah in al-Faqih wal-Mutafaqih, he mentions again, to the best of one's ability, one must learn the fard that is the fard knowledge that is obligatory upon them. And he gives some examples. And he said that this must be enforced by the ruler of the Muslims, that the husbands, for example, teach their women folk, and there must be people who are who have been appointed by the government, by the ruler, to teach people. Right? وَيَجِبُ عَلَى الْعُلَمَاءِ تَعْلِيمُ الْجَاهِلِ. Right? And it's necessary for the ulama to teach the ignorant. And it's necessary for the ignorant also to be conscious of the fact that they're ignorant and they have an obligation to go and learn. Imam al-Bayhaqi rahimahullah in al-Madkhal, he refers to the hadith طلب العلم فريضة على كل مسلم, and he says, yeah, it's probably not authentic, but if it is authentic, then what's meant by it? He says what's meant by it is إنما أراد والله أعلم العلم العام الذي لا يسع البالغ العاقل جهله. So what's meant is al-ilm al-am, from what we've seen in the statement of Imam al-Shafi'i, and he quotes the statement of Imam al-Shafi'i, that every mature, sane person must know. And أو علم ما ينوبه خاصة, right? Or the knowledge that arises in his particular situation. So a person finds that there's a death in the family, so they must know about the rules of inheritance. They get married, they must know certain rules regarding that, right? They encounter different family members, some may be mahrams, some may not be mahrams, they must know the rules regarding that. And Imam al-Bayhaqi also said that, or it could be a situation where there's nobody in the community who is doing the fard kifaya knowledge. So there's other knowledge which is fard kifaya, like knowledge of Arabic, knowledge of hadith, knowledge of tafsir, and there's nobody doing that in the community. So then it becomes an individual obligation, everybody, a collective responsibility, which has now been neglected. So therefore, every single person is responsible now. Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah in Ihya Ulum al-Din, he has a lengthy explanation of the knowledge that is fard ayn, the knowledge that is an individual obligation. So he says that everybody has an obligation when it comes to beliefs, when it comes to actions, and when it comes to omissions. Right? So there are certain things that we must believe as Muslims. There are certain things that we must do as Muslims. And there are certain things that we must refrain from as Muslims. And Imam al-Ghazali says, so when a person, it's sort of hypothetical, but he's just painting a picture and is explaining the nature of the obligation, which is that when a person becomes baligh and they are sane, right? So they become baligh, they become mature, either through a wet dream, or through beginning menstruation, or however it may be. And again, so that's also a point of knowledge. How does a person become baligh? But that's those two things are the most common ways, through a wet dream for males and haid for females. So once they become baligh and they are aqil, the first obligation that they have is to know La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. What does that mean? And to have that firmly instilled in their heart. Right? So as I said, this is sort of like a hypothetical. Obviously, in Muslim households, they would be taught this even before they turn baligh. But once they are baligh, that's when the obligation comes into effect. But in order for it to not be delayed, obviously, it should be ensured that they are taught these things before that as well. And he mentions that salah time will obviously approach, so then they have the obligation of learning wudu and how to pray salah and the obligations of salah and all of that. and a person then may live till Ramadan, so they have the obligation of learning the rules of fasting, and a person may have wealth, so therefore they have to learn the rules of zakat, and the Hajj season may enter and they've got enough money to go, then they have to learn the obligation of Hajj and the rules of Hajj and so on. And regarding the prohibitions, so there are basic prohibitions that everybody must know, like zina is forbidden, theft is forbidden, riba is forbidden, and so on. But then there are certain prohibitions which may be context specific, like certain types of food. Is this food forbidden for me because in that particular context? Imam al-Ghazali gives the example of, for example, a mute person who can't speak, doesn't have to learn the knowledge of things, forbidden speech, for example. A person that is blind doesn't have to learn the knowledge of forbidden things to look at, for example. And what Imam al-Ghazali says is that the society, the culture that a person finds themselves in, they will be exposed to certain things in terms of ideas and also in terms of practices and norms. And based on that, a person will have a certain obligation of what they need to be taught and what they need to learn and know. Right? So he says, فإن كان في بلد شاع فيه الكلام وتناطق الناس بالبدع فينبغي أن يصان في أول بلوغه عنها بتلقين الحق فإنه لو ألقي إليه الباطل لوجب إزالته من قلبه وربما عسر ذلك. Right? He said that when there are mistaken beliefs that are being spread and people are communicating these beliefs, and these are innovative beliefs, and Muslims are saying this is what Islam says, and these are wrong beliefs and wrong ideas, and these are circulating and widespread in a particular community or at a particular time, then Muslims and Muslim households must ensure that the children are taught from an early stage that these beliefs exist and these beliefs are wrong. Right? To prevention is better than cure. To prevent these beliefs, protect them from these beliefs from before they become exposed to them. Because if they are exposed to them, then it would be necessary to remove it from their hearts, and that may be difficult. So therefore, they must be protected from them from beforehand. This is what Imam al-Ghazali says, and he gives an example. كما أنه لو كان هذا المسلم تاجرا وقد شاع في البلد معاملة الربا وجب عليه تعلم الحذر من الربا. Right? So if there's a Muslim who is a businessman and the transactions of interest are very common in his town, then he must have the knowledge of having to he must learn how to save himself from these types of transactions. Right. Burhanul Islam Az-Zarnuji rahimahullah in Ta'alim al-Muta'allim Tariq al-Ta'allum. He's a student of Sahib al-Hidayah, the author of Hidayah. So a Hanafi scholar. He again explains what does Talab al-Ilmi Faridatun ala kulli Muslim mean. And he explains in terms of ilm al-hal, the situation that a person finds themselves in. So they must have the knowledge that is required for them in that situation, right? Because he says that innahu la budda lahu min as-salah, so a person must obviously pray salah. So then he must know what he needs to know in order to fulfill his obligations of salah. Right, and he gives several more examples. And one other point that he mentions is Imam al-Ghazali, as I said, he mentioned that there's three things. There's the beliefs, there's the actions, and the omissions. So the actions, things that one must do and things that one must refrain from, those would also apply to the actions of the heart. right? So a person, when they are doing their salah and when they are worshipping Allah, they must have the intention that they are doing it for Allah. And the motive must not be that they are doing it for other people or to please other people or to show off, right? So that's an action of the heart, right? Where ikhlas in that sense is obligatory and riya is prohibited. So people must also learn that knowledge as well. Right? Al-Mawsili rahimahullah, another famous Hanafi scholar, in al-Ikhtiyar, he mentions that the fard knowledge هو مقدار ما يحتاج إليه لإقامة الفرائض ومعرفة الحق من الباطل والحلال من الحرام وهو محمل الحديث. Right? So the fard knowledge is the amount that is needed in order to accomplish the obligations and to know truth from falsehood and to know halal from haram. And this is what is meant by the hadith. The hadith طلب العلم فريضة على كل مسلم. Right? So in a summary, the knowledge that is obligatory on every Muslim relates to beliefs and it relates to actions. And actions include obligations and prohibitions. And there's the basic knowledge that every Muslim must have regarding their beliefs and their actions, whether actions of the limbs or actions of the heart. And then there's the individual circumstances that a person finds themselves in, and they must have the knowledge of those particular circumstance, of that particular circumstance. And what does that mean? That means that every Muslim must have some connection with learned people so that they can find out the answers, the solutions to particular issues. And this also relates to beliefs as well. So if there's a belief that is contrary to Islam and that is playing on a person's mind, then they must get that resolved through learned people. And Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, he mentions, or it's reported from him that he mentioned something to that effect as well. Right? And based on this understanding, every Muslim can understand, can see, am I fulfilling my obligation as a Muslim in terms of the knowledge that I need to have learned and acquired? And as I said, it's pervasive that Muslims are falling short in this very fundamental, very basic obligation. Okay. And may Allah rectify our condition. Okay, we'll stop here. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.